So now we have our db.json file with all our data in it, and we set up the JSON server to watch this and give us access to endpoints to interact with it and get the data. Let's try fetching the data from the jobs component. Now at the minute we're just creating the data directly inside this component, but typically when we make a project we wouldn't do that. Our data might change over time and it would be stored in something like a database. Now we're not using a database in this case, we're just using JSON server, but we will use databases later, and the concept of fetching the data from an external source are still the same. So the first thing I'm going to do is delete the data inside this jobs array. Now I will keep the jobs property because ultimately we want to cycle through those jobs to output them to the screen. All we're going to do is fetch the data from this external source, and then we're going to populate this jobs property with that data. And then once it has that data, we can cycle through them. All right. So the first question is, where do we get this data? At what point? Well, a popular place to get it is inside the mounted lifecycle hook. Remember, a Vue component has lifecycle hooks which fire at different points during its lifecycle. The mounted one fires when the component mounts the DOM. So at that point, we're going to go out and fetch the data. Now to do this, we'll be using the fetch API. Now, if you don't know much about fetch or promises or asynchronous JavaScript in general, definitely check out the last chapter in this whole course where I talk about different JavaScript features. I cover fetch and promises right there. So if this is confusing, check that out. So we need to pass in an endpoint to the fetch method, and that endpoint is provided to us by JSON server right here. So it's this thing to get all the jobs. So I'm going to highlight that and copy it, and I'm going to paste it inside here, inside a string like so. So this is going to go out and fetch that data for us and return it in JSON format. Now this is asynchronous and it returns a promise. So what I'm going to do is tack on a then method which fires a callback function after this is done. Now this returns an object with JSON data included in it. Now in order to actually get that data, that JSON, and pass it into JavaScript, we need to take the response which we get as an argument here, and we need to use the JSON method on it. So we say response.json. This is how we work with the fetch API. Now, when there's only one argument inside the callback function, we can remove the parentheses, which is what I'm going to do. And this thing right here, this is also asynchronous, and that also returns a promise. So all we need to do is tack on another then method, which will fire another function when this is complete, and this function gets access to a different argument, and that is the actual parsed data. So whatever data we have right here, we get back. All right, so it's going to be an array of objects. So what do we want to do with that data? Well, all we want to do is populate this array right here with that data. Remember, this is an array of data. So all we need to say is this.jobs to get the jobs property that we have right here and set it equal to the data that we get back, which is an array of JavaScript objects, an array of jobs. And that's all we need to do. Now, since this might error, if something is wrong with the asynchronous task, we can tack on a catch block, which will fire a function if there is an error, and we get that error back as an argument inside this function. All I'm going to do is console.log the error.message if there is one. So every error that we get back will have a message property which tells us what the error is. All we're doing is logging that out if there is an error. So now let's see if this works. Hopefully everything should still look the same. We should see on the page these three jobs. So let me save this and preview, and this is the endpoint. We don't want that. I'm going to go to Ninja Jobs and then go to Jobs, and we can see we still have all of these three jobs. And if I hard refresh, we can see for a second it's blank while it makes the fetch, and then once we have the data, it outputs them. Because remember, to begin with, the jobs is just an empty array. It's only after we have the data right here that we populate that array, and then we can output it. Okay, so that's how we get external data. We can make a fetch request inside the mounted hook to update a property, then cycle through that property to output it to the screen. Now, I also want to make a fetch request inside the job details component because currently all we're doing is outputting the ID over here. And we can see on the job details page, we see the job ID is 2. Now, I want the full data of that job. I want all of this stuff right here for that job so we can output the job title and the details, even though it's just one word. So I'm going to have to make another fetch request over here inside this component to get the job with the ID that we have right here. So again, let's do a mounted hook, and this is where we're going to fetch the data. So what I will do is go back to jobs and just copy all of this fetch request right here and paste it in right here. Now this time the endpoint has to be a bit different because we don't want all jobs, we just want a single job. So in order to get a single job, it has to be / and then whatever the ID is of the job we want to get. So in our case, it would be this right here, the ID of 2, if we were on this page. Now we have the ID, remember, we accept it as a prop when it's passed in as a wrap parameter, so we can use it and we can tack it on the end by saying plus this.id. This because we reference the component, and ID because we have that as a prop. All right. So now this will be either 1, 2, or 3, depending on what job we're trying to view. We're getting the response, we're parsing the JSON, then that data will this time be either an object, which is this job, or this job, dependent on the ID. And so we have access to that object. Now what I'd like to do is store that object inside some component data. So I'm going to create a data function, and inside this, return an object. We need our comma after data, don't forget that. And I'm going to create a property called job. Now to begin with, that will be null. But once we have this data back from the fetch, I'm going to say this.job, not jobs, is equal to that data. So this will now be a JavaScript object, which represents one of those jobs. And we're also catching the error if there is one and logging it to the console. So now I have this job. We could maybe output those job details on the page because we have these different properties. We have the title and the details which we can use. So instead of this in the H1, I could output maybe the job title like so. And then at the bottom, I could do a paragraph and output the job details as well, like so. Now, if we try this in a browser, let me just save it, we're going to get an error, and I'll explain that in a second. First of all, let me just refresh over here. And notice now we don't get anything at all. Now, if we open up the console, then we're going to see an error over here. And if we scroll up, that error says cannot read property title of null. So inside our template, we're saying job.title, and we can't do this because it's saying we can't get the title property from null. But why is this null? Because we're trying to retrieve a job object. Well, it's null because to begin with, when we first load the component, we set the job to be null. We only have a value for the job when we retrieve it using the fetch API, and that takes a second or so to get. So to begin with, when we first load the page, we're trying to output the title property of null. It's only when we have a value for the job that we can do that. So we need to figure out a way to conditionally output this stuff right here only when we have a value back from the fetch request. And we'll see how to do that next.